The world, once a tapestry of predictable routines and comforting familiarity, was unraveling with terrifying speed. The incessant chatter of the news, initially dismissed as sensationalist fear-mongering, had morphed into a chilling symphony of dread. Each broadcast painted a starker, more visceral picture of a contagion that respected no borders, no age, no health. It was a silent, invisible enemy, and its advance was relentless. He tried to shield her, to shield himself, from the escalating panic, clinging to the belief that sanity would prevail, that science would outpace the insidious spread. But sanity was a luxury the world could no longer afford, and science, in its most advanced form, was proving agonizingly inadequate. His wife, Sarah, the steady anchor of his existence, the quiet force that grounded him, was now the focal point of his unraveling world. A fever, so fierce it seemed to burn from within, had taken hold of her with a ferocity that defied explanation. It wasn't the familiar flu, nor the more aggressive, though still treatable, viruses he'd read about. This was something else, something alien and terrifyingly efficient. Their home, once a sanctuary, a haven from the clamor of the outside, had become a sterile, hushed chamber of suffering. The pristine white walls, the neatly arranged furniture, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, all seemed to mock the raw, ragged sounds that now filled the air. Her labored breaths were a metronome of their impending doom, each ragged inhalation and strained exhalation, a hammer blow to his already fragile composure. The silence in between was even worse, pregnant with the unspoken fear that clotted his throat. He would sit by her bedside for hours, the cool weight of her hand a phantom in his own, tracing the veins that stood out like blue rivers beneath her increasingly translucent skin. Her eyes, once bright with laughter and love, were now clouded, unfocused, staring at some distant terrible vista that only she could see. Each pained sigh, each involuntary tremor that racked her body, sharpened the edges of his despair, transforming his grief into a gnawing, visceral dread. He watched her, and he watched the world outside their window, and the chilling realization began to dawn. The infection was not just consuming his wife. It was consuming everything. The sterile quiet of their home, once a sanctuary, now echoed with the labored breaths of a dying woman and the growing dread of the unknown unfolding outside their window. Every cough, every pained sigh, sharpened the edges of his despair. The faint distant wail of sirens, once a common sound in the city, now seemed to carry a note of frantic desperation, a mournful chorus for a world teetering on the brink. He found himself counting the seconds between her breaths, a morbid ritual that only amplified the suffocating tension. The rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, once a source of comfort, was now a constant reminder of her fading life, a visceral counterpoint to the growing chaos he could sense just beyond their walls. He would catch himself staring at the dust motes dancing in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the drawn curtains, each one a tiny speck of normalcy in a world gone mad. He longed for the mundane, for the trivial annoyances that had once filled his days. A jammed printer, a traffic jam, a misplaced set of keys. These were the hallmarks of a life he had taken for granted, a life that was now slipping through his fingers like sand. He found himself listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, trying to discern if they were the familiar sounds of settling wood or something more sinister, some manifestation of the decay that was spreading like a plague. He remembered the initial news reports, the grainy footage of masked figures in hazmat suits, the hushed tones of the anchors discussing a novel virus with alarming speed. He had dismissed it then, as most had, as an overblown media frenzy, a temporary scare. Now, those memories felt like a cruel joke, a testament to his own willful ignorance. He had been so caught up in the quiet rhythm of his life, in the warmth of Sarah's presence, that he had failed to see the storm gathering on the horizon. He had been lulled into a false sense of security, and now the tempest was upon him, its fury unleashed. He would often find himself standing by the window, peering through a tiny gap in the curtains, his heart hammering against his ribs. The street, usually bustling with the ebb and flow of daily life, was eerily deserted. A lone car sat abandoned in the middle of the road, its doors ajar, a silent testament to a sudden panicked flight. The usual symphony of the city, the honking horns, the distant rumble of construction, the laughter of children was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence, punctuated by the unsettlingly irregular wail of those sirens. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that screamed of fear and abandonment. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the world outside was no longer the world he knew. The threads of civilization were fraying, and the fabric of society was tearing apart. He could feel it in the air, in the unnatural stillness, in the growing sense of unease that permeated even the confines of his home. It was a primal fear, a deep-seated awareness of being on the precipice of something ancient and terrible, something that threatened to undo all that humanity had built. His focus, however, had to remain on Sarah. He monitored her temperature with obsessive regularity, his hand trembling as he held the thermometer against her feverish skin. He administered the meager medications he had stockpiled, a desperate futile attempt to fight a battle he was clearly losing. He spoon-fed her sips of water, her lips cracked and dry, her eyes fluttering weakly as she tried to acknowledge his presence. Each moment was a tightrope walk between hope and despair, a constant oscillation between the belief that he could still save her and the crushing certainty that he was merely delaying the inevitable. He found himself talking to her, even when she couldn't respond, recounting memories of their life together, of their first meeting, of their wedding day, of the quiet evenings spent reading side by side. He spoke of his love, of his gratitude, of the irreplaceable void she would leave behind. These monologues were a desperate attempt to anchor her, to remind her of the life she was fighting to hold on to, and perhaps, more selfishly, to remind himself of the man he was, the man who had loved her so deeply. He knew these words might be lost in the fog of her fever, but he spoke them anyway, for the sound of his own voice, a defiant ripple against the encroaching silence, was the only thing that felt truly his own. The sterile quiet of their home, once a sanctuary, now echoed with the labored breaths of a dying woman and the growing dread of the unknown unfolding outside their window. Every cough, every pained sigh, sharpened the edges of his despair. He studied her face, etching every feature into his memory. The delicate curve of her jaw, the slight crinkle at the corner of her eyes when she smiled, the way her brow furrowed when she was deep in thought. He knew these details would become precious relics, fragments of a world that was rapidly receding into the past. He was becoming a historian of their life, meticulously cataloging the memories that were all he had left. He began to notice subtle changes in her, not just in her physical state, but in the way her eyes sometimes fixed on a point beyond the wall, a vacant stare that sent shivers down his spine. He'd read enough, seen enough in the fleeting news reports, to understand the terrifying implications. This wasn't just a fever. It was a transformation. And the thought of that transformation, the horrifying possibility of what she might become, was a deeper, more visceral terror than her dying breaths. It was a fear that threatened to eclipse even the profound grief he already felt. The sterile quiet of their home, once a sanctuary, now echoed with the labored breaths of a dying woman and the growing dread of the unknown unfolding outside their window. Every cough, every pained sigh, sharpened the edges of his despair. The knowledge, gleaned from hushed whispers on the edge of official reports and the frantic, unfiltered chatter of the internet before it too began to falter, was a poison in his mind. It spoke of a contagion that didn't just kill, but fundamentally altered. It was a pathogen that rewrote the very essence of being human, turning loved ones into something monstrous, something driven by instinct and hunger. He pushed the thought away, trying to cling to the Sarah he knew, the woman who was the bedrock of his existence. But the thought, once planted, had taken root, its tendrils of fear constricting his heart. He watched her sleep, her breathing shallow, her face pale and drawn. He noticed the slight twitch of her fingers, the almost imperceptible tremor in her limbs. Were these the signs of a body fighting a losing battle, or the harbingers of something far more sinister? He couldn't tell, and the uncertainty was a torment. He found himself holding his own breath when she stirred, straining to listen, to discern. His senses, once dulled by the routine of domestic life, were now razor-sharp, attuned to every nuance of her condition, to every subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room. The sterile quiet of their home, once a sanctuary, now echoed with the labored breaths of a dying woman and the growing dread of the unknown unfolding outside their window. Every cough, every pained sigh, sharpened the edges of his despair. He would run his fingers through her hair, now matted and damp with sweat, and a wave of tenderness would wash over him, followed immediately by a surge of revulsion. Not at her, but at the thought of what she might become. It was a grotesque paradox, this love and this fear coexisting, tearing him apart from the inside. He was trapped in a waking nightmare, forced to witness the slow, agonizing decay of the woman he loved, and to contemplate a fate for her that was infinitely worse than death. The sterile quiet of their home, once a sanctuary, now echoed with the labored breaths of a dying woman and the growing dread of the unknown unfolding outside their window. Every cough, every pained sigh, sharpened the edges of his despair. He found himself pacing the confines of their bedroom, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished wooden floor. He wrung his hands, his mind racing, desperately searching for an answer, a solution, a way out of this impossible situation. But there was nothing. The world outside was descending into chaos, and the enemy within their own walls was an unseen, unstoppable force. He looked at the framed photographs on the dresser, their wedding, a vacation by the sea, a simple snapshot of them laughing on a park bench. These images, once cherished reminders of a happy life, now felt like cruel taunts, evidence of a world that was irrevocably lost. He remembered the hushed conversations on the news, the veiled references to the aggression of the infected, the descriptions of their unchanging hunger. He had categorized these as the ramblings of sensationalists, the desperate attempts to explain the inexplicable. Now, those words echoed in his mind with terrifying clarity. He pictured Sarah, his Sarah, her gentle eyes turned vacant, her loving hands reaching out with a primal, unthinking need. The image was so abhorrent, so alien to everything he knew of her, that it threatened to shatter his sanity. The sterile quiet of their home, once a sanctuary, now echoed with the labored breaths of a dying woman and the growing dread of the unknown unfolding outside their window. Every cough, every pained sigh, sharpened the edges of his despair. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had to make a choice. A choice that no one should ever have to make. A choice born not of malice or cruelty, but of a desperate, heartbreaking love. A choice to protect her from a fate worse than the slow decay of her body. A choice to preserve the memory of the woman she was, rather than witness the grotesque transformation into something she was not. The silence in the room, broken only by her ragged breaths, became a tangible weight, pressing down on him, suffocating him with the enormity of the unspoken agony that hung in the air. It was a decision that would define him, a burden he would carry for the rest of his days, a solitary act of mercy in a world that had lost all mercy. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure the image of her smile, her laughter, the warmth of her presence. He needed to hold on to that, to let it guide him through the darkness. He had to be strong, not for himself, but for her. For the woman who had been his everything. The sterile quiet of their home, once a sanctuary, now echoed with the labored breaths of a dying woman and the growing dread of the unknown unfolding outside their window. Every cough, every pained sigh, sharpened the edges of his despair. The decision, though agonizing, was becoming clear, not out of a desire to end her life, but out of an unbearable need to preserve her spirit, her memory, from the horrors that awaited her. It was an act of profound love, cloaked in unimaginable grief, a final, desperate act of protection against a fate that was 1,000 times worse than death. The sterile quiet of their bedroom had become a crucible, each tick of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway, a hammer blow against his resolve. Sarah's breathing, a shallow, ragged whisper, was the only sound that dared to break the suffocating stillness. He watched the subtle rise and fall of her chest, a fragile testament to a life teetering on the precipice. The fever had receded, leaving behind a profound weakness, a skeletal fragility that tore at his heart. But with the receding fever came a new, more insidious terror. The stillness. It was a predatory quiet, the kind that precedes a storm or the silence of a hunter after the kill. He knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the storm had not passed. It had merely changed its form. He traced the delicate line of her jaw with a trembling fingertip, the skin cool and papery beneath his touch. Her eyes, usually so full of light and life, were now shuttered, their depths clouded with an opaque haze. Yet, in moments, a flicker of recognition, a faint glimmer of the Sarah he knew, would surface. It was during these fleeting instances that his resolve would waver, replaced by a desperate clawing hope that this was simply a severe illness, that the Sarah he loved would return. But then the haze would descend again, and the cold dread would creep back, whispering its terrible truths into the hollows of his mind. The whispers were not his own. They were the echoes of a world gone mad, the fragmented narratives of a contagion that did not merely kill, but corrupted. He had spent countless hours, hunched over book salvage from deserted libraries, devouring everything he could find on emerging pathogens, on the terrifying adaptability of viruses. He'd started with scientific journals, dry and clinical, then moved to speculative fiction, to conspiracy theories, to ancient folklore. It was a desperate, often contradictory tapestry of information, but threads of a common horror began to emerge. This wasn't just a biological weapon. It was something that targeted the very essence of humanity, that rewrote the code of being. The reports, though often garbled and incomplete, spoke of a transformation, a grotesque metamorphosis that turned the infected into something else entirely. Something driven by instinct, by hunger, by a primal rage that obliterated all memory of love, of compassion, of self. The thought of that transformation, of Sarah, his Sarah, becoming such a creature, was a physical agony. He imagined her eyes, once pools of gentle understanding, now burning with an unreasoning, insatiable need. He pictured her hands, hands that had soothed his brow and held his own with such tenderness, now reaching out with a predatory intent. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. This was not a question of life or death. It was a question of existence, of preserving the sanctity of her memory, of the woman she was, against a horrifying specter of what she might become. It was a choice between two unbearable losses, and he had to choose the one that allowed her spirit, at least, to remain untainted. He rose from the bedside, his knees protesting, and walked to the window. The curtains were drawn, but slivers of pale moonlight managed to penetrate the fabric, casting ghostly patterns on the floor. Outside, the world was silent. Not the comfortable silence of a sleeping city, but a vast, unnerving emptiness. He had seen the signs in the days leading up to Sarah's sickness, the abandoned cars, the flickering streetlights, the unnatural stillness that had descended like a shroud. The initial reports of chaos had given way to a profound absence of sound, a silence that spoke of a population decimated, of survivors either fled or transformed. He remembered the hushed conversations he'd overheard in the panic days before their self-imposed isolation, fragments of conversations about the afflicted not merely dying, but changing. They spoke of a loss of self, a reversion to something primal. He had dismissed it then as fear-mongering, as the panicked ramblings of a society unraveling. But now, sitting in the tomb-like quiet of their home, with Sarah's labored breaths a fragile counterpoint to the world's oppressive silence, those ramblings felt like chilling prophecy. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rough against his palm. This was not the decision of a coward, of someone afraid of grief. This was the agonizing calculus of love, a brittle equation where the variables were unbearable suffering and eternal loss. To let her succumb to the illness was to condemn her to a slow, agonizing fate. To let her recover, only to potentially become something monstrous, was to annihilate everything she was, everything they had shared. His mind wrestled with the ethics, with the sanctity of life, with the ingrained instinct to protect. But what was protection, when the very definition of life was being so horrifically rewritten? He walked back to the bedside, his steps heavy, each movement weighted with the enormity of his contemplation. Sarah stirred slightly, a faint moan escaping her lips. He knelt beside her, taking her hand. It was cool, almost clammy, but a faint pulse fluttered beneath his thumb. It was a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting her to the world he knew, but also a beacon that illuminated the abyss that lay before them. He began to speak, his voice a low rumble, a desperate attempt to fill the void with the familiar sound of his love. He spoke of their first meeting, of the nervous stumble of his words, of the way her laughter had lit up the room. He recounted their wedding day, the joyous chaos, the solemn vows. He shared memories of quiet evenings, of shared dreams, of the comfortable silence that had always existed between them, a silence that had never been empty, but always full of understanding and unspoken affection. He poured his heart out, not for her ears, for he knew she could barely process his words, but for his own soul. He needed to reaffirm their connection, to ensure that the memory of his love, the true essence of Sarah, remained vivid and untarnished, even if the vessel that held it was destined for something terrible. "Remember that trip to the coast, Sarah?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The little cottage with the blue door. We stayed up all night, watching the waves crash against the shore. You said it was like watching the world being born anew." He paused, tears blurring his vision. "I wish we could see it again. I wish we could see it all again." He spoke of her strength, of her kindness, of the countless ways she had enriched his life. He was painting a portrait with words, a vibrant, living image of the woman he adored, a bulwark against the encroaching darkness. He knew that no matter what happened, no matter what form the contagion took, this memory, this love, would remain. It was his anchor, his truth, in a world that was rapidly losing all semblance of reality. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, a physical burden that threatened to crush him. He was not a killer. He was a man who loved his wife. But in this new world, love itself demanded brutal acts of mercy. He had to find the strength to choose not only for himself, but for her, for the Sarah he would carry in his heart forever. The moonlight shifted, casting long shadows across the room, and in those shadows, he saw not just the present horror, but the agonizing path he had to walk. The choice was unspoken, a silent covenant between his love and his fear, a desperate act of preservation in the face of utter annihilation. He remembered reading about the plague doctors of old, their morbid fascination with death, their detached observation of suffering. He felt a kinship with them, a chilling understanding of their clinical gaze. But his gaze was not detached. It was steeped in a love so profound it was a form of unbearable pain. He was not observing. He was contemplating a final terrible act of devotion. He was the guardian of her final moments, the architect of her peace, whether that peace came through a gentle release from suffering or a swift merciful end to a fate worse than any death he could imagine. He looked at the small vial of sedatives he had managed to find, a desperate find in the chaos of a looted pharmacy. It was a tool, a means to an end, but the end itself was the true agonizing choice. to administer it, to guide her gently into a sleep that might not be a sleep at all, but an oblivion that would save her from what was coming. The alternatives were unthinkable. To witness her transformation, to face the horror of what she might become, to perhaps even be forced to confront that horror directly. That was a fate far more terrifying than any plague doctor could have conceived. He gently stroked her forehead, her skin cool against his palm. "It's okay, my love," he murmured, the words a desperate reassurance to himself as much as to her. "It's okay. I'm here. I'll always be here." His voice cracked, the facade of strength crumbling. He was a man adrift in an ocean of grief and terror, clinging to the last vestiges of his humanity, to the memory of a love that was now demanding an impossible sacrifice. He watched her sleep, her breath still shallow, but perhaps, just perhaps, a fraction less labored. The moonlight cast a soft glow on her face, highlighting the delicate curve of her lips, the long sweep of her lashes. She looked peaceful, almost ethereal. He had to hold on to this image, this fleeting moment of serenity, as he navigated the treacherous path ahead. The silence of the room was no longer just empty. It was pregnant with the unspoken, with the terrible, profound choice he was about to make, a choice born of a love so deep it defied all logic, all convention, all understanding. It was the ultimate act of protection, a final heartbreaking gift to the woman who had been his world, his everything. He knew that the world outside was gone, but the world they had built together, the world of their shared memories and unspoken love, that was what he was fighting to preserve. And in this desolate, terrifying new reality, preservation sometimes meant letting go. The pre-dawn air hung heavy and still, a palpable tension that mirrored the turmoil in his soul. Outside, the world was holding its breath, unaware of the silent, monumental shift occurring within the confines of their sanctuary. He looked at Sarah, her face bathed in the faint, ethereal glow of the moon that still lingered on the horizon, a fragile peace settled upon her features. The shallow breaths, once a source of agonizing anxiety, now seemed to whisper a gentle farewell. He had made his choice, a choice born of love, of despair, and of a terrifying foresight. It was a decision etched not in stone, but in the very marrow of his bones, a covenant with his own heart that would forever define the desolate landscape of his existence. He moved with a deliberate slowness, each movement steeped in a profound, aching reverence. The vial, its contents a potent cocktail of oblivion, felt impossibly heavy in his trembling hand. It was not a weapon, but a key, a passage to a peace he could no longer grant her in this waking world, a world that was rapidly transforming into a nightmare. He thought of the whispered accounts he had pieced together, the horrific tales of transformation, of the loss of self, of the irreversible descent into primal hunger. The alternative was too monstrous to contemplate, a violation of everything she was, everything they had shared. This was not an end. It was a preservation. A desperate, heartbreaking preservation of her memory, of the woman he had loved with every fiber of his being. With a tenderness that belied the immense grief consuming him, he gently administered the sedative. He watched as her eyelids fluttered, then slowly closed, her breathing growing shallower, softer, until it was no more than a faint whisper against the oppressive silence. He stayed by her side, holding her hand, his thumb tracing the delicate veins that ran beneath her skin, a map of a life lived, of a love shared. He spoke softly, murmuring words of comfort, of eternal devotion, of forgiveness for the unspeakable act he had committed. His voice, a rough baritone, was the only sound in the room, a low lament against the encroaching silence of her passing. He whispered her name over and over, as if to imprint it onto his very soul, to anchor it against the storm that was gathering outside. The first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and soft rose, a stark contrast to the internal twilight that had descended upon him. The sunrise, a symbol of hope for most, was for him the stark illumination of a new, solitary reality. There were no witnesses to this final agonizing act, no shared grief, no comforting presence. It was a deeply personal tragedy, a profound and solitary ordeal that marked the true, unyielding beginning of his solitary existence. The weight of responsibility, of having to carry this secret, this burden, settled upon him with a crushing finality. He remained there for a long time, lost in the quiet solemnity of the moment, the last vestiges of their shared life ebbing away with the fading moonlight. He memorized the contours of her face, the gentle curve of her lips, the delicate arch of her brows, etching every detail into his memory. These were the images he would carry forward, the precious fragments of a life that had been his world. He whispered promises of remembrance, of a life lived in her honor, of a legacy that would carry her spirit forward, even in this broken world. As the light strengthened, he finally stirred, his body stiff and aching, his heart a hollow echo chamber. He rose from the bedside, his movement slow and measured. He knew what he had to do. A ritual of closure, a necessary preparation for the world outside, a world that was no longer their shared haven, but a battlefield. He began to tidy the room, to restore a semblance of order to the space that had witnessed such profound intimacy and such devastating loss. Each action was deliberate, almost ceremonial. He straightened the pillows, smoothed the sheets, and gently closed Sarah's eyes, a final tender gesture. He removed any trace of the final moments, not to erase the memory, but to honor the peaceful transition he had facilitated. The memory of her serene final moments was seared into his mind, a stark and poignant contrast to the cacophony he knew was already erupting beyond their walls. He bathed her face with a damp cloth, his touch infinitely gentle, as if trying to wash away not just the lingering traces of illness, but the very concept of suffering. He imagined he could still feel the warmth of her skin, the faint tremor of her hand in his. He was creating a tableau of peace, a final image of the Sarah he had loved, untouched by the encroaching horror. It was a desperate attempt to preserve the sanctity of her memory, to ensure that the woman she was, the woman he adored, would remain untainted in his mind. He then turned his attention to the room itself. He gathered the medical supplies, the discarded vials, the empty water glasses, and anything that spoke of illness and struggle. These were artifacts of a past that was rapidly dissolving, remnants of a life that had been. He disposed of them carefully, methodically, each item a small farewell. He then opened the curtains, allowing the full unyielding light of day to flood the room. It was a symbolic act, an acknowledgement of the new reality, of the world that awaited him. The sunlight, harsh and unforgiving, felt like an indictment, a stark reminder of the life that continued, even as his had irrevocably changed. He walked through their home, a ghost in the halls that had once echoed with laughter and shared whispers. Each room held a memory, a tender imprint of their life together. The kitchen, where they had shared countless meals, the living room, where they had curled up by the fire, the small study, where they had spent quiet evenings immersed in books. He touched the worn spines of his books, the silent witnesses to his solitary education, to the knowledge he had painstakingly gathered. They were his companions now, his teachers in this new, brutal curriculum of survival. He paused at the window, looking out at the street. The silence that had permeated their lives in the preceding days now seemed even more profound, more menacing. It was a silence that spoke of absence, of a world emptied of its vibrant pulse. A few abandoned cars littered the street, silent sentinels of a sudden catastrophic exodus. The normally bustling town was eerily deserted, a ghost of its former self. A chilling stillness hung in the air, a heavy precursor to the inevitable storm. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that the whispers he had heard, the fragmented reports of a contagion that did not merely kill but transformed, were not mere rumor. They were the harbingers of a new terrifying order. He returned to the bedroom, to the peaceful tableau he had created. He took one last look at Sarah, her face still in repose, a perfect fragile sculpture of serenity. He whispered a final promise, a vow to survive, to honor her memory, to carry her essence within him, as he navigated the treacherous paths ahead. He would not succumb to the despair, not entirely. He would channel his grief, his love, his pain, into a fierce, unyielding will to endure. He would become a testament to the life they had shared, a living memorial to the woman he had lost. With a deep, shuddering breath, he turned and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch was a definitive sound, a seal on a chapter of his life, a chapter filled with love, with shared dreams, and with an unbearable, final act of mercy. He stood in the hallway, the weight of his solitude pressing down on him, a physical manifestation of his loss. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, a shrine to a love that had transcended life itself. He moved towards the front door, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. He knew the world outside was a brutal, unforgiving place, teeming with the grotesque remnants of humanity. But he was no longer the man who had entered this ordeal, seeking only to protect his dying wife. He was something new, forged in the crucible of grief and necessity. He was a survivor. And he carried within him the memory of a love that would be both his greatest strength and his most profound sorrow. The final kiss, though unspoken and unseen, was a promise, a silent covenant etched into the fabric of his being, a reminder of what he was fighting for and what he had lost. The journey had begun, not with a bang, but with a silent, heartbroken whisper. The house, once a symphony of shared life, had become a tomb. Each empty room echoed with the phantom laughter, the whispered conversations, the very breath of Sarah, a life now extinguished by his own hand. The silence wasn't an absence of sound, but a suffocating presence, a heavy shroud woven from his grief and the unnatural stillness that had descended upon the world. He moved through the familiar spaces, a stranger in his own sanctuary, each object a potent agonizing reminder of what had been and what would never be again. The worn armchair where they'd read together, the chipped mug he'd always used, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, they were not comforts, but shards of glass, each one drawing blood with every encounter. He found himself in the living room, the afternoon sun slanting through the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating the space with a harsh, indifferent light. His gaze fell upon the bookshelf, a testament to their shared intellectual curiosity. He ran a hand over the spines, his fingers tracing the titles they had discussed, debated, and cherished. The Odyssey, its pages dog-eared from countless readings, spoke of a long, arduous journey, a theme that now felt chillingly prescient. Beside it, a collection of Emily Dickinson poems, her stark introspection a mirror to his own internal landscape. He remembered Sarah's gentle voice reading aloud, her eyes alight with understanding, a shared moment now lost to the echoing void. He resisted the urge to pick up a book, to lose himself in its familiar embrace. To do so would be to invite the past to consume him entirely, a luxury he could no longer afford. The kitchen, a hub of their domesticity, felt particularly hollow. He saw the faint imprint of her hand on the refrigerator door, the way she'd always left little notes, reminders of errands, of love, of mundane daily life that now seemed impossibly precious. The worn cutting board on the counter bore the faint scars of years of use, each mark a silent testament to meals prepared, to shared nourishment, to a life lived in tandem. He pictured her there, flour dusted on her apron, a smile playing on her lips as she hummed a tune. The image was so vivid, so real, it was a physical ache in his chest. He forced himself to turn away, his focus a desperate fragile thing, clinging to the present, to the urgent need for action. Survival. The word was a cold, hard stone in his gut. It was the only purpose left, the only task that could provide a semblance of structure to the chaos that threatened to engulf him. He began to gather supplies, his movements methodical, almost robotic, a stark contrast to the tempest raging within. He moved through the house with a practiced efficiency, his mind a sharp keen instrument focused on the immediate, the tangible. He needed water, non-perishable food, a first aid kit, and anything else that could sustain him in the coming days, weeks, months. He emptied cupboards, his hands working with a detached precision, filling backpacks and duffel bags with provisions. Each item packed was a small victory against the encroaching despair, a tangible step towards an uncertain future. He found himself in their bedroom, the scene of his final, devastating act of love and mercy. The bed was neatly made, a sterile testament to his attempt to impose order on the uncontainable. He looked at the pillows, the space where her head had rested, and a fresh wave of grief washed over him. He had to leave. He couldn't stay in this mausoleum of memories. He turned his back, his jaw tight, and moved towards the closet, his hand searching for appropriate clothing. He chose sturdy, practical items, layers that would offer protection against the elements, clothes that wouldn't draw undue attention. He was no longer the man who had lived here, the man who had loved and been loved. He was becoming something else, something forged in the fires of loss and necessity. The distant wail of sirens, a sound that had become a constant, unnerving thrum in the background of their final days, sliced through the silence. It was a mournful, insistent cry, a soundtrack to the unraveling of civilization. He paused, listening, his senses heightened. It was a reminder of the world outside, a world that was rapidly descending into pandemonium. He had heard the fragmented reports, the chilling whispers of what was happening, of the infected, the changed, the horrors that stalked the streets. He pushed the thoughts away, his mental shield snapping into place. Dwelling on them would be a fatal error. He found a sturdy backpack in the hall closet, a relic from a hiking trip they had planned but never taken. It was a painful reminder, but also a practical tool. He began to fill it with a deliberate pace, his hands never faltering. Canned goods, water bottles, a multi-tool, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, each item was a calculated addition to his burgeoning arsenal of survival. He moved with a grim determination, the emotional toll of the past few hours, a dull ache beneath the sharp focus of his immediate needs. He couldn't afford to break down. Not now. Not ever, perhaps. He opened the front door, the hinges creaking in protest, a sound that seemed amplified in the unnatural quiet. The air outside was thick with an unsettling stillness, a palpable tension that mirrored his own internal state. The street, usually alive with the mundane bustle of a typical afternoon, was eerily deserted. Abandoned cars lined the sidewalks, some with doors ajar, as if their occupants had vanished mid-journey. A few stray pieces of litter tumbled across the asphalt, propelled by a phantom breeze. It was a scene of surreal desolation, a tableau of a world abruptly emptied of its inhabitants. He stepped out onto the porch, his senses on high alert, the weight of his solitude pressing down on him like a physical force. He scanned his surroundings, his eyes darting, taking in every detail. The houses across the street were silent, their windows dark and unseeing. A child's bicycle lay on its side on a manicured lawn, a poignant symbol of innocence lost. He saw no movement, heard no sounds other than the persistent mournful wail of the sirens, now a little more distant, a little less immediate, but no less unsettling. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a chilling awareness of being utterly, irrevocably alone. This was not just the loss of Sarah. It was the loss of everything he had ever known, everything he had taken for granted. He checked the contents of his backpack one last time, his hands moving with a practiced efficiency. He had water, food, basic supplies. He had his wits, honed by years of preparation and now sharpened by the brutal reality of his situation. He had the memory of Sarah, a bittersweet anchor that would both drive him forward and threaten to drag him down. He took a deep, steadying breath, the cool air filling his lungs. The past was a ghost, a tormenting specter he had to outrun. The future was a terrifying unknown, a landscape of danger and uncertainty. All he had was this moment, this present, and a desperate, unyielding will to survive. He turned his back on the house, on the sanctuary that had become a tomb, and began to walk. His footsteps were soft on the asphalt, swallowed by the vast, unnerving silence. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The echoes of his life with Sarah were imprinted on every wall, every floorboard, every object within those walls. To linger would be to succumb to the overwhelming tide of grief. He was a man on a mission dictated by the primal instinct to endure, to carry on the legacy of a love that had been brutally, irrevocably severed. He walked towards the edge of town, towards the unknown, his shadow stretching long and thin before him, a solitary figure against the encroaching darkness. The house, filled with the echoes of his past, faded behind him, a silent monument to a life that was no more. He was moving forward, propelled by a desperate hope and haunted by the ghosts of what he had lost, a solitary voyager on a sea of uncertainty. The soft click of the door closing behind him was a punctuation mark, a definitive end to the chapter of his life that had been confined within those four walls. It was a sound so ordinary, so mundane, yet in the context of the unraveling world, it felt like the closing of a tomb, sealing away not just memories, but the very essence of who he had been. He stood on the porch, the chipped paint cool beneath his fingertips, and took a breath that felt both too shallow and too deep. The air itself seemed heavier, imbued with an unseen tension, a primal awareness that the world he had known had ceased to exist. He stepped off the porch, his worn boots landing on the cracked asphalt of the driveway. The street stretched out before him, a canvas of desolation under the pale, indifferent light of the nascent dawn. The sun, a bloody smear on the horizon, seemed to mock the stillness with its promise of a new day. This was no gentle awakening. It was a grotesque resurrection, a world reborn in horror. Abandoned cars, like metallic carcasses, littered the street, some tilted at unnatural angles, their doors gaping open, as if their occupants had simply dissolved into the ether mid-flight. Overturned bins spilled their refuse onto the pavement, a silent testament to the frantic uncoordinated flight that had clearly preceded this eerie quiet. A child's tricycle lay on its side on a patch of once pristine lawn, a vivid splash of primary colors against a muted dust-choked landscape. It was a scene that defied logic, a nightmare rendered in concrete and steel. And then he heard it. A low, guttural sound, a wet rasp that scraped against the silence. It was the sound of the infected, the changed, the things that now shambled through the remnants of civilization. It was a sound that had been a distant thrum in the background of his final days in the house, a morbid soundtrack to his private tragedy. Now, out here, it was a palpable threat, a chilling reminder of the new order that had been brutally imposed. The sounds were not uniform. Some were distant, mere echoes carried on the sluggish breeze, while others were closer, closer than he cared to acknowledge. Each moan, each shriek, was a spike of adrenaline, a fresh wave of raw fear that he ruthlessly suppressed. He was a solitary figure, a lone ship adrift on a sea of contagion. His only companions were the ghosts of his past and the ever-present threat of the present. His grief, a heavy cloak woven from loss and regret, was both a burden and a strange sort of armor. It was the tangible proof of the life that had been, the love that had existed, and it fueled a nascent will to endure, a flicker of defiance against the encroaching darkness. He was armed with nothing but his sorrow and this burgeoning instinct for survival, a primal urge that had somehow taken root amidst the devastation. He began to walk, his steps measured, each one carrying him further from the sanctuary that had become a tomb. He moved with a deliberate pace, not out of courage, but out of a desperate need to keep moving, to outrun the paralysis that threatened to seize him. His eyes scanned his surroundings with an almost frantic intensity, cataloging every detail. The familiar streets of his town were now alien, transformed into a grotesque theater of the apocalypse. The houses, once symbols of comfort and community, stood silent and dark, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the ruin. Some had their doors splintered, their interiors ransacked, hinting at the chaos that had erupted. Others seemed untouched, eerily pristine, as if the apocalypse had passed them by, leaving them in a state of suspended animation. He noted the details with a survivor's eye. A discarded shopping cart, its wheels frozen in place. A scattering of newspapers, their headlines screaming of a world that was now a distant memory. A lone shoe, lying forlornly on the sidewalk, a stark reminder of someone's hurried final steps. Each object was a story, a fragment of the lives that had been extinguished or irrevocably altered. He felt a profound sense of detachment, a necessary dissociation from the human tragedy unfolding around him. To dwell on each individual loss would be to drown in despair. He had to compartmentalize, to focus on the immediate, the tangible, the actionable. The silence was not absolute. It was a fragile shell, constantly threatened by the distant chilling sounds of the infected. A sudden screech, metallic and sharp, echoed from several blocks away, followed by a series of frantic panic shouts that were abruptly cut short. He flinched, his muscles tensing, his hand instinctively reaching for the sturdy multi-tool in his backpack. It was a meager weapon, but it was something. He reminded himself to stay quiet, to tread lightly, to become as invisible as possible. His worn hiking boots, usually a source of comfort on familiar trails, now felt loud and clumsy on the deserted pavement. He wished he had thought to find softer shoes, something that wouldn't announce his presence to every lurking horror. He moved with a grim purpose, his mind a finely tuned instrument of observation and assessment. He was not just walking. He was scouting, mapping, evaluating. He mentally noted potential routes, escape paths, places that might offer shelter or resources, and more importantly, places to avoid. The bakery on the corner, its windows still intact, offered the tempting aroma of stale bread, a cruel tease. He dismissed it. The risk of encountering anyone, living or dead, was too great. He needed to get out of the densely populated areas, to find open spaces where his senses could be more reliable, where he could see the threat coming from a greater distance. The weight of his backpack, laden with the essentials of survival, was a constant reminder of his new reality. Water, canned goods, a basic first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries. These were not just supplies. They were the currency of his existence now. He had grabbed what he could, driven by a desperate pragmatism that had overridden his initial shock. He had even taken a sturdy kitchen knife, its blade gleaming ominously in the dim light. It was a tool, a weapon, a symbol of his newfound reliance on his own hands. As he rounded a corner, a sudden movement caught his eye. A dog, a scruffy terrier mix, darted out from an alleyway, its tail tucked between its legs, its eyes wide with fear. It barked, a series of sharp, desperate yaps, before disappearing down another street, a fleeting echo of the normal world. He watched it go, a pang of something akin to longing for its simple, unburdened existence. But he couldn't afford such sentiments. He was a man, burdened with the weight of consciousness, with the knowledge of what had been lost. The city, once a vibrant tapestry of human life, was now a desolate ruin. The sounds of the infected, though still unsettling, began to blend into a low, constant hum, a morbid reminder of the new inhabitants. He found himself moving through a surreal landscape, a ghost in his own town. The familiar landmarks were still there, but they were hollowed out, stripped of their life, their purpose. The towering office buildings stood like silent sentinels, their windows dark and lifeless. The park, usually teeming with families and joggers, was overgrown and deserted, the swings creaking mournfully in the breeze, a macabre dance of empty seats. He continued to move, driven by an instinct he hadn't known he possessed. It was a quiet desperation, a refusal to be consumed by the horror. He was not a warrior, not a hero. He was simply a man who had lost everything, and in that loss, had found a single unwavering purpose. To survive. To see another sunrise, not as a symbol of hope, but as a challenge to be met, a testament to his continued existence in a world that seemed determined to erase him. The journey had just begun, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, yet he walked on, his shadow a solitary stain on the desolate street, a testament to the enduring, if grim, spark of life. The dawn, now fully risen, cast long, distorted shadows, and he stepped further into the heart of the ruin, a lone figure venturing into the unfolding apocalypse. He had no destination, only the desperate need to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the place where his old life had ended. The air, though still heavy, felt slightly less suffocating as he moved away from the denser parts of the town, towards the less populated outskirts. Every distant moan, every scuttling sound, was a jolt, but the sheer volume of the desolation was, in a perverse way, a form of camouflage. He was just one more lost soul in a world that had lost its way.